Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the 11th in our series from 1 Peter, which I've entitled Godly Living in Difficult Days. Peter had spent the opening chapter of his letter addressing some of the issues that all Christians face in the world, especially during times of great difficulty. And Peter knows what it's like at times like these. He knows it can be very easy to stray, especially into areas of unrighteousness and even sin. And as a result, our conduct, when we do that, can bring disrepute on the church and even on our faith. So Peter's words are very relevant for every generation of Christian. Now, in the last episode in our series, from chapter 2 and through verses 13 to 17, Peter had asked his readers to have an attitude of submission to people in every human institution. In that passage, he began with the way in which we are to respond to those who've been appointed over us in civil government. And he made it clear that our underlying motive always is to be out of a fear of the Lord. He said, whatever we do must be for the Lord's sake. And this virtue of submission, because we could call it that, is a theme that runs through the verses in chapters 2 from verse 13 right through to chapter 3 and verse 6. And once we've covered those passages in this series, we'll see that Peter applies it in three main ways. Firstly, it involves Christians submitting to all people around us, taking note of the position in which God has put them. And second, it involves employees submitting to their employers. And here Peter addresses house servants who were invariably slaves in Peter's day. And we're going to look at this aspect of Peter's letter today. And then third, which I'm going to address a bit later on, Peter will be saying something similar to Christian wives and their husbands. So let's have a look once again at 1 Peter 2, and we're going to read from verses 18 to 21. And I'm reading from the English Standard Version. Servants, be subject to your masters with all respect, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the unjust. For this is a gracious thing when, mindful of God, one endures sorrows while suffering unjustly. For what credit is it if, when you sin and are beaten for it, you endure? But if, when you do good and suffer for it, you endure, this is a gracious thing in the sight of God. For to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example so that you might follow in his steps. Now, the NIV translates the word servants as slaves, because this is probably what those servants were in Peter's day. Technically, you see, slavery as it used to exist in Peter's day has been abolished in our day. Even though, in reality, it has probably continued in a number of different forms and also in much greater numbers. Servants or slaves in those days were workers. They were employees, if you like. In our modern context, this passage would therefore be addressing all those people who find themselves employed by somebody else, whether it's in terms of an employment contract or on a part-time or a piecework basis. The key to this is that there is a relationship of some kind between the worker and the employer, between the servant and the master, as Peter refers to them in this passage. Now, because the workplace is actually quite different today, we have a question that, does this passage of Scripture have anything to say to us? And the answer is yes, and there are at least two reasons. Firstly, the Bible caters for the worst work situation that there can be, which is slavery. If the Bible can help people in the worst kind of employment, surely it can help us in easier situations. So if the ancient Christians could survive as slaves, surely by following the same advice, we should be able to survive anywhere. But there's a second reason why this advice is practical. It's all very well for people in affluent countries to say that slavery is abolished, but is it really? I know of people in more than one country whose labour conditions are about the same as that of the slaves of the ancient world. For example, poor rural people in parts of South America work long hours and in very hard conditions. They have to harvest coca leaves for the cocaine trade, and most of the time they do this just so that they can put food on the table. Children in the Ivory Coast in Africa are used similarly to harvest cocoa beans for the chocolate industry, and very often their conditions of employment are not too much different to those helping the drug industry. We also find factory workers in China's industrial areas work and even sleep in their factories. These people are paid wages far below our minimum wage rate. They work much longer hours, and then they're very often forced to sleep in the factories in what is known as warm beds. Yeah, one person is woken up to go to work, and then when he's gone, you jump into his bed. Now, also in countries like America and even our own country, some employers take on illegal immigrants at substandard wages and make them work longer hours because they can't complain to the authorities about their conditions. So we see that Peter's instruction is as up to date as tomorrow's newspaper. Peter's not just looking here for unconditional submission, though, but he wants it to be with all respect, as he puts it. Just as he said in verse 17 about fearing God, his words here, with all respect, have a very similar meaning. You see, when Peter says with all respect, he means with respect or fear to God, not to the master. Paul says something similar to the Colossians in Colossians 3 verse 22. He writes, "Bondservants, obey in everything those who are your earthly masters, not by way of eye service as people pleasers, but with sincerity of heart, fearing the Lord." Once Peter has set out before his readers what he expects of us in this regard, he goes on to tell us that there are two main benefits to having this attitude of submission. The first one is that submission is pleasing to God. Who really likes to be submissive to other people? And honestly, I can't say submission comes easily to me, even in good situations. So Peter says that when we do, it's a gracious thing in the sight of God. Or, as some translations might say, it's excellent behavior in the sight of God. It's relatively easy, you see, to submit in an environment which makes it easy to do so. But it takes a special kind of grace to be respectful in a painfully unjust situation. In such a situation, we must remember that quiet respect, even towards the oppressor, is generally God's will. And it is that kind of excellent behavior that pleases God, and He will honor us for it. Peter is giving us some very practical help here. And I think sometimes people tend to read Peter's words and they think that it doesn't really apply to them because, well, they're having it so much harder, you know. So, come on, Peter, you've no idea how difficult it is to work for this man. He shouts all the time. He's constantly micromanaging everything I do. Nothing seems to be good enough for him. If I take time off because I'm not well, he thinks I'm lying. If something's missing from stock, he'll assume that I've taken it. And I have to beg for an increase in my wages just to cover cost of living. And it always involves an argument. And you're suggesting that I must just grin and bear it? Well, no, that's not what Peter's saying either, because that doesn't reflect a submissive attitude. Grinning and bearing it is hardly submissive. A submissive attitude, Peter says later when he's talking to Christian wives, is revealing what he says a respectful and pure conduct. So Let your outward attitude, Peter says to the Christian wives in chapter 3, reflect what he calls the hidden person of the heart, with the imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which in God's sight is very precious. Just think of those words, the hidden person of the heart, with the imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit. Peter says, in God's sight, this is something very precious. And Peter even tells wives that this kind of conduct has great power. It's got power to win over their unsaved husbands without them speaking. And I think the same principle applies in the workplace. Peter asks us to take this matter very seriously. He says we are to live mindful of God, or as another translation puts it, out of conscience towards God. Let us remember, though, that Peter is speaking of unjust treatment by an employer. After all, there's no great virtue in standing strong when we're suffering because of our own stupidity or our own sin or foolishness. There's nothing special about that. I remember a Christian lady who worked for me in the middle 1990s, and she was supposedly very devout in her faith, so much so that I often found her not at her desk doing the work that I was paying her to do. And when I questioned her about it, she told me that she found sometimes the pressure of work was so much she just needed to go off and pray and spend some time reading her Bible. And I thought to myself, well, yeah, I understand that, but I eventually had to ask her to leave because, quite frankly, the work wasn't getting done. And her attitude wasn't a submissive attitude, it was a fully expectant that I would just accept it, as I was also a Christian. And this was really the opposite attitude to that of those Christian workers in Stalin's Russia. Remember that story that I mentioned in a previous episode. I think this lady probably felt that she was suffering for her faith when I asked her to go. I leave that for you to decide. But you see, Peter here is speaking generally. Nobody has to submit to an employer when he or she asks us to sin. In Acts 5:29, you'll remember that the council of Pharisees had ordered the apostles not to teach in the name of Jesus. And Peter simply said that that was an order that they couldn't obey. He said, we must obey God rather than man. But if we resist someone with authority, especially authority over us, we must make sure that it is a matter of sin. Resistance or defiance out of a difference of opinion or because we just don't like the man or woman will receive no blessing. And it could even have a very unpleasant consequences. So I would like to digress at this point for a few minutes just to talk about Christians and trade unions and also the world of work in more general terms and of course more contemporary terms. I raise this point because a trade union and its elected officials could be included in Peter's definition of every human institution that we need to submit to. Christians may, by virtue of where they work, be required to join a trade union as a condition of service. Now, in this instance, the employee, or the servant or slave, as Peter refers to them, will be faced with the dilemma of submission to parties who may well be on opposite sides of any labor dispute. On the one hand, they have the employer, and the other, they have their representative union. Now, I don't have a problem with the concept of trade unions as they were meant to be, which is that representative voice of employees in the relationship with their employers. The trade union movement began because employers failed to stick to biblical principles. And so employees found that banding together to defend basic rights was the only way that they could resolve this problem. but it led to major divisions. Firstly, these unions were generally part of a broader industry-wide representation, and their demands very often override the requirements of individual employers for the sake of the collective industry. It effectively nullifies the authority of the employer. So let's try and imagine what it would be like in a home. Let's say a teenager joins an association formed for the rights of teenagers all over the world. This teenager would be faced with a similar submission dilemma to his parents or to the association in the case of a dispute. Now, what we see in many parts of the world, and especially in South Africa, is that the trade unions have tended to venture into the political arena, and by virtue of the numbers of their membership, they can effectively direct the affairs of state. Many of these unions, particularly in South Africa, have Marxist socialist fundamentals, and as a result, they are generally hostile to Christian values. In my opinion, this has created major problems in our country, not unlike those that are faced by the British government in the 1980s. Now, as a member of such a trade union, the Christian may find him or herself being required to compromise on their faith. They may even be required to participate in actions that would be anything but submissive. Excuse me, they may even be sinful. Now, we know for a fact that in certain cases, trade union members have been responsible for wanton damage to public and private property, probably even assault and the taking of human life. So at the outside, the Christian, who is also a member of a trade union, may be faced with having to stand against what the union is aiming for. And this could result in persecution of a very different kind. So the question would be, should a Christian join these organizations? Well, in trying to find an answer, let's consider the following two scriptures. In 1 Corinthians 5 and verse 9 to 10, Paul writes these words: I wrote to you in my letter not to associate with sexually immoral people, not at all meaning the sexually immoral of this world, or the greedy and swindlers or idolaters, since then you would need to go out of the world. And then he also writes in 2 Corinthians 6 verse 14, do not be unequally yoked with unbelievers, for what partnership has righteousness with lawlessness? Or what fellowship has light with darkness? Now, these two scriptures can create a great deal of confusion for the Christian. One passage tells us to stay in the world, and the other one tells us to come out of the world. So how do we apply these words if we find ourselves in a trade union with some dodgy habits? Well, I think the scriptures tell us that while we are to be involved in the world and its affairs, we are to do so as salt and light, and we are not to be compromised in our testimony. So there may come times of great testing and even persecution, and so once again, Peter's words are very relevant to us. Remember what Jesus said, blessed are the peacemakers. Now, there's a second benefit about this kind of submission that Peter raises here. And that is that we have an example to show us the way. The greatest example is Jesus himself. Peter says in verse 21, for to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example, so that you might follow in his steps. Jesus, we see, acted as a house servant himself. When he got down and washed his disciples' feet, he set the pace and he showed us the way. And so we realize that endurance in the midst of injustice is part of the Christian's calling. We are called to it. It's part of Christian conversion. It's a guarantee that it will happen. And when we experience salvation, it is with the purpose of becoming like Jesus. And this is the kind of life that Jesus lived. Jesus was a human being. You might think that because he was actually God in the flesh, that his sufferings were somehow not real. But this isn't the case. The things he suffered, I think he felt as much as we would have done if we were in his position. I think that when he was slandered, it hurt him as much as it would hurt me. I think that when his enemies were watching to find some way of catching him out in what he said, I think he felt the pain of it. And I think that the loneliness, the disgrace, the rejection, and the sense of frustration at the sheer injustice in the way he was being treated, it must have been a burden to him, just as it would have been to any one of us. But brethren, there is one huge difference. And Peter says here, the difference is that Jesus suffered for you, for each one of us. These sufferings were part of what he had to go through in order to be a real human being. If the Son of God had never become a real human being, there would have been no suffering for him. He voluntarily stepped into a position where there would inevitably be a lot of suffering. The Bible tells us he took the form of a servant, subjecting himself to the will of his Father, enduring everything that was necessary for him to save the human race. Now, says Peter, Jesus was leaving you an example so that you might follow in his steps. We simply have to face the fact that the more we experience God's grace, the more God will get us to be like Jesus. Then we are to live in the way that he lived. I think the author to the Hebrews sums it up so well in chapter 12 and verses 1 to 3. He says, "Let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and the perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured from sinners such hostility against himself, so that you may not grow weary or faint-hearted." He despised the shame, the writer says in verse 2. So we do the same. We disregard any feelings of embarrassment we might have when we're badly treated. We live in the way he lived, with dignity, with faith, with patience. He lived for the joy that was set before him. We do the same. We live for the joy of hearing God saying to us one day, "Well done, my good and faithful servant." So we do not grow weary and faint-hearted, Peter says. So may grace and peace be multiplied to you all. God bless you.